In the previous video, we briefly introduced the concept of multi-GPU training. Let's now take this a step further and talk about the different multi-GPU training strategies. So here's an overview of the broad categories of parallelism when we are using multi-GPU training. There's model parallelism, data parallelism, pipeline parallelism, tensor parallelism, and sequence parallelism. And let's talk about what these different parallelism strategies are and how they work. Let's start with the simplest technique, model parallelism. So this is usually useful in the context of limited GPU memory. So for example, if we have a very large model, what we can do is we can put different layers on different GPUs to work around these memory limitations. So in PyTorch code, we can use two CUDA calls for different layers of the network to put it on the different GPUs. But in practice, this is not really recommended and there are actually better strategies. Another strategy is tensor parallelism, which is related to the model parallelism that we introduced on the previous slide. However, here the advantage is that we are splitting the layer horizontally. That means we are splitting it such that we can carry out the computations in parallel. In model parallelism, we have different layers on different GPUs and we create a sequential bottleneck, which is of course slower. So why does tensor parallelism work and why is it more efficient than model parallelism? So to illustrate the concept, think of matrix multiplication. So here I have an example where I'm multiplying a 2×3 with a 3×2 matrix. And if the matrix on the right consists of two columns, we can split that into two matrix multiplication problems that we can carry out in parallel. So here we multiply now the matrix on the left with the first and with the second column vector separately. And then once we carried out this computation, we can concatenate these two results to obtain the original results that we would get when we multiplied the two matrices. And yeah, you can see we can carry out these two computations in parallel, which makes us very efficient as a multi-GPU training strategy. So just for completeness, we can also carry out the tensor parallelism this way, where we split the matrix on the left into two row vectors. And then we can carry out the row vector times matrix multiplication 2 times separately and concatenate the results. And yeah, this makes tensor parallelism a very useful strategy if we are dealing with large layers and large matrix multiplications. Now another strategy that is a bit different is data parallelism. So where tensor parallelism usually deals with limited GPU memory, data parallelism is to increase the training throughput. So here what we are doing is we are splitting the batch to train the models on more data in parallel. So for example, we can create two copies of the model and place one copy on one GPU and the other copy on the other GPU. And then using different data points, we train both models in parallel and then average the gradients when we update the models. So yeah, this way we can go through the data faster by training the models in parallel on different GPUs. And note, this is only a brief introduction. We have a dedicated video to explain this concept in more detail later. So let's now talk about pipeline parallelism, where pipeline parallelism is a mix between data and model parallelism, where the model is split across different blocks. So think back of the original model parallelism strategy where we have different layers on different GPUs, which is visualized here. And the F stands for the forward pass and the B stands for the backward pass. And then these different blocks are executed from left to right. For example, if layer 1 is on GPU 4, we carry out the computation on GPU 4 first. Then we go to the GPU 3 for the next layer, to GPU 2 for the next layer, and then to GPU 1 for the last layer, before we attempt the backward pass in reverse order. So pipeline parallelism is optimized so that the GPUs can work better in parallel. So that means that there is more overlap between the computations, such that one GPU doesn't have to wait for the other GPU to finish, and there is some work that the two GPUs can do in parallel. Okay, now on to the last concept here, sequence parallelism. Sequence parallelism was specifically developed for transformer models, and it's about splitting the input sequence across multiple GPUs to also deal with memory limitations. Now that we introduced all these different types of multi-GPU training strategies, which strategy should we actually use in practice? Personally, as a good default, I recommend using distributed data parallel and see if that works for you. And in order to enable that, you can simply set strategy equals to DDP. And yeah, of course, if you are using a notebook, use DDP_notebook here. In some cases, you might encounter problems with pickling, so in that case, you may also have to use DDP spawn instead. But unless you have problems with pickling, I recommend using DDP because it's a bit faster. So remember, in distributed data parallel, we are copying the model to different GPUs, and in this case, if we have memory concerns, if the model is too big for GPU memory, we may want to use DDP sharded. So DDP sharded is essentially a flavor of data parallelism with additional tensor parallelism. And sharding here would refer to the splitting of the tensors. Now, as alternatives to DDP sharded, there are also the different deep speed strategies. For example, in deep speed stage 2, it will shard the optimizer and the gradients. And if this is not enough to deal with memory limitations, you can also use the stage 2 offload strategy. So offloading here means offloading the optimizer and the gradient states to the CPU memory. However, offloading things to the CPU memory will make things slower due to the additional transfer during training. So I would only use the offloading strategy if you really have to due to memory limitations. Now, if you have a smaller number of GPUs and the training speed is not a big concern, for example, when you are fine-tuning a large model on a smaller data set, there are also some workarounds when you have only one or a small number of GPUs. And for that, I would recommend using the stage 3 strategies in deep speed. So the deep speed 3 strategy will essentially shard everything, the optimizers, the gradients, and the weight parameters. And yeah, as an alternative to the deep speed stage 3 strategy, there's also FSDP, which stands for fully sharded data parallel. So depending on your machine, one or the other may be faster. So in practice, I would recommend giving either one a try. So in this video, we saw a brief overview of the different parallelism strategies. And I also gave you some recommendations for which strategy to use in practice. In the next video, we will dive deeper into data parallelism and see how it works under the hood.